Listen up. As Frontum echtergum animalibus diversifies, some clades may evolve to feed on the detritus that ended up beneath the soil at the bottom of the ocean. They developed a segmented body plan and reduced the feeding surface into a simple flap on the front of their body, which is used to pull sediment into their body. It will then be passed through the newly developed gut cavity, coming out to the other end of the animal. They also developed scent organs in their flap to determine what is and isn't edible. They also bear a stinger through which they emit various pheromones for identification and signaling things like "I'm being eaten" or "I want to mate." Oh, and they now have sexual reproduction. The gametes, sex cells, are kept in glands next to the hormone glands in the last segment, and it's also worth noting that these glands first developed for reproductive purposes. I'll call this phylum Pterum eruntvermes, or groundworms. As Pterum eruntvermes breaks up the rocks Imamo et Sumo Animalibus was able to sit on into soil, they will need to develop a more proactive way to hold on to this looser ground. So, they may develop 4 more limbs to stick to the ground with suction cups. Again, to feed, they use 8 limbs to filter feed and breathe. And do note that they also have hairs on the ends of the arms for the sake of more filter feeding space, more surface area, all that. Though I'm not showing that for the sake of simplicity. Same goes for the fact I'm only showing 4 feeding arms as opposed to the whole 8. And at their top is the release hole from which they expel feces, and they will also release something else from this hole. Sex cells. They use an overall system of broadcast spawning very similar to the Villae plantae, where they release gametes of their sex into the currents and hope that they encounter a gamete of the opposite sex and fertilize. I'll call this phylum Stellipides, or starfeet, as opposed to the anapods, or no feet, again in ancient Greek. At some point, a clade of Frontin echtergum animalibus evolved to float in the water. They achieved this by duplicating their feeding surface at the other end of the organism, and widened it, forming a surface that's pulled on by the currents. I'll call this organ the kite. And like Emo e Sumo Animalibus, they developed feeding arms, in this case using them to bring food inside the gut, created by moving their feeding surface inside the body. I'll call this phylum Milvus Animalibus, or kite animals. So in conclusion, they use their kites to float through the surface, and a blind gut which they bring smaller plankton into with feeding arms to survive. And for defense, they spew tons of offspring all the time, similar to insects or krill on Earth. Among them are loner plantae and small heterotrophs called macrobacteria, which I'll get into in the next episode. Among them as in among their prey. Outro time. So today we actually have a lot to get into. First of all, in part 2, episode 2, the one on local animals, one of the clades I introduced was the protozoans. As it turns out, that's the name of a clade of early eukaryotes in the real world. So I'm trying to find a new name for it. If you have suggestions, I left a comment on the video asking if any suggestions, so leave it in a reply to that. Second of all, this video took almost 2 weeks. Well, videos in general are going to take longer, but for a couple of reasons. One, I'm now voice training. I'll get into that more later, as well as the fact that school's starting up again, and I'm trying to go for longer videos, but also I had to deal with some personal stuff, which greatly lengthened the time it took to make this video, but videos should now be coming out like once every 8 weeks, not 8 minutes. And on the voice training, yeah. Basically, it's a thing trans people do. Basically changing our habits of how we talk to make ourselves sound more feminine or masculine, depending on gender, But yeah, given that it's a slow process, you might be able to identify individual recording sessions